On this day in history, May 26, 1818, Chile, the Hussar of Death, the life and assassination of Manuel Rodriguez Erdoza. He was Chile's most daring revolutionary, a master of disguise, a rallier of nations, a thorn in the side of every empire that dared stand against his people's freedom. On May 26, 1818, he was shot dead on a dusty road. He was 33 years old.
The road from Santiago to the prison at Quillota was long and lonely, threading north through dry Chilean hills, still brown from the summer heat. On the morning of May 26, 1818, a small military escort rode along that road, guarding a single prisoner. The prisoner was Manuel Rodriguez Erdoza, lawyer, spy, guerrilla commander, folk hero, and the most beloved revolutionary figure in Chile. He was being transferred to military prison, his fate already sealed by the men in power who feared him. He never arrived. Somewhere in the scrubland near the village of Tiltil, the soldiers escorting him opened fire. The official story, announced by the government of Bernardo O'Higgins the next day, was that Rodriguez had been killed while trying to escape. Virtually no one believed it. His body was mutilated and thrown into a ditch. Peasants who lived nearby crept out, found the body, wept over it, and buried him secretly beneath the altar of a small chapel. They were too afraid to let the government know where he lay. Chileans would argue about who ordered the killing for the next 2 centuries, but on one thing there has never been any doubt. The murder of Manuel Rodriguez was the first political assassination in Chilean history. And like all political assassinations that misjudge the depth of a people's love, it achieved the precise opposite of its intent. Instead of erasing Rodriguez from memory, it made him immortal. To understand why he had to be silenced, you have to understand who he was and what Chile was in those furious, magnificent years when a continent broke free. Chile is a strange and dramatic country, a thin ribbon of land crushed between the Andes Mountains and the Pacific Ocean, stretching nearly 4,300 kilometers from the driest desert on Earth in the north to the frozen tip of South America in the south. Its geography made it one of the most isolated corners of the Spanish Empire, and that isolation gave its people a particular character, proud, self-reliant, and fiercely attached to their land. Spain had conquered the region in the mid-1500s, following the same brutal template it had used across the empire, crushing the indigenous peoples, establishing a colonial hierarchy, and shipping the continent's wealth back to Madrid. Chile was never as spectacularly rich as Peru or Mexico. It had no great gold or silver mines to rival Potosi. Its value to Spain was more strategic than economic. It was the southern anchor of the empire, a buffer against the unknown territories of Patagonia and the threat of rival European powers seeking a backdoor into the Pacific.
Spanish colonial society was rigidly stratified. At the top were the peninsulares, Spaniards born in Spain who held the highest positions of power and looked down on everyone born in the New World. Below them were the criollos, people of Spanish descent born in Chile, who could be educated, wealthy, and prominent, but were systematically excluded from the highest offices of government and church. Below the criollos were the mestizos, of mixed Spanish and indigenous ancestry. And at the very bottom of the colonial pyramid, the indigenous peoples and African slaves.
The Criollo grievance. The criollos were perhaps the most dangerous class in the colonial system. They were educated enough to read Enlightenment philosophy, wealthy enough to have something to fight for, and frustrated enough by their exclusion from power to fight for it. It was from this class that nearly all of Latin America's independence leaders came. Manuel Rodriguez was one of them.
By the early 19th century, the world was shaking. The American Revolution of 1776 had proven that colonies could break free.
The French Revolution of 1789 had unleashed ideas of liberty, equality, and popular sovereignty that crossed every ocean. And in 1808, Napoleon Bonaparte invaded Spain, toppled the Spanish king, and placed his own brother on the throne, an act of breathtaking arrogance that sent shockwaves through every Spanish colony in the Americas. If the King of Spain was illegitimate, what about the authority of his colonial representatives? Who did the colonists actually owe loyalty to? Across the continent, Criollo intellectuals and military officers began asking questions that had no safe answers, and coming to conclusions that could only end in revolution. Manuel Javier Rodriguez Erdoza was born on February 27, 1785, in Santiago de Chile, the colonial capital, a city of low white buildings, dusty plazas, and aristocratic pretension, crowded beneath the great snow-capped wall of the Andes. His background placed him in that fascinating, precarious zone that Chileans called the poor aristocracy, a family with a proud name and almost no money to put behind it. His father, Carlos Rodriguez de Herrera, was a Spanish customs officer, a minor functionary of the empire, respectable but far from powerful. His mother, Maria Loreto de Erdoza, came from a distinguished Peruvian family of Basque descent that traced its roots back to the earliest conquistadors, and she had inherited something from her first marriage. The family lived in a fine house in the center of Santiago. They had no servants. Appearances were maintained. The tension between the name and the reality shaped Manuel's character profoundly. He understood both worlds, the privileged and the struggling, with an intimacy that few of his contemporaries could match. He was sent to the best school in the colony, the Carolino College, where the sons of Santiago's finest families sat together in long rows and absorbed their Latin, their theology, and their early politics. It was here that he sat beside a boy named José Miguel Carrera, the scion of one of Chile's most powerful aristocratic families, headstrong and passionate and magnetic. Their friendship would define much of Manuel's life and ultimately contribute to his death. After Carolino, Rodriguez studied law at the Royal University of San Felipe. He graduated and became a practicing attorney in 1807, sharp, persuasive, with the lawyer's gift for argument and the actor's gift for inhabiting a role. He was slender and dark-eyed, possessed of what contemporaries described as an unusual physical grace and a quality of presence that made rooms pay attention when he entered them. He had charm that worked on everyone, from judges to street vendors. He would need every bit of it. The Patria Vieja, Chile's first try at freedom, 1810 to 1814. On September 18, 1810, a date Chileans still celebrate as their national holiday, the leading citizens of Santiago gathered and voted to form their own provisional governing council, the Primera Junta Nacional de Gobierno. They were careful to frame it as loyalty to the captive Spanish king rather than outright rebellion. But everyone understood what the real direction of travel was. The clock on Spanish colonialism had started ticking. Rodriguez, just 25 years old, threw himself into the independence cause with the energy of a man who has finally found the thing he was born for. In 1811, he was appointed attorney for Santiago and then elected parliamentary representative for the city of Talca. He drafted political pamphlets, argued cases for patriots in colonial courts, and attached himself to the orbit of his old schoolmate, José Miguel Carrera, who had returned from military service in Spain, burning with revolutionary fire. José Miguel Carrera was brilliant, charismatic, and reckless. He staged 3 coups in the single year of 1811, seizing control of the Chilean government through a mixture of political maneuvering and military intimidation. His rivals in the independence movement included a soldier of mixed Chilean and Irish descent named Bernardo O'Higgins, son of a former governor of Chile, who led a competing faction.
The two men despised each other with a depth of feeling that their common cause of independence could never fully paper over. Rodriguez, caught between his loyalty to Carrera and the practical realities of the revolution, found himself increasingly uncomfortable.
The two rivals, Carrera versus O'Higgins. The feud between José Miguel Carrera and Bernardo O'Higgins was the great fault line of Chilean independence. Both men were genuine patriots who genuinely despised each other. Carrera was more radical, more popular with the urban masses, more willing to improvise. O'Higgins was more disciplined, more trusted by the Argentine liberator José de San Martín, and, ultimately, more politically ruthless. Their rivalry would cost the independence movement dearly and would directly lead to Manuel Rodriguez's death. The period from 1810 to 1814 is called the Patria Vieja, the Old Fatherland, Chile's first experiment with self-government. It was turbulent, exciting, and ultimately tragic. The new Chilean government was too divided to govern effectively. The Spanish colonial authorities were regrouping, and from the south, the Royalist Army, forces loyal to the Spanish crown, was advancing. October 1, 1814, the Battle of Rancagua. The Chilean patriot forces, divided between the Carrera and O'Higgins factions and unable to coordinate effectively, are crushed by the Royalist army of General Mariano Osorio. The Patria Vieja collapses. Spanish rule is restored. The leaders of the independence movement flee over the Andes into Argentina. Chile is back under the crown's boot, and the era of repression begins.
The Spanish governor who took control of Chile after Rancagua was a man named Casimiro Marcó del Pont, famously vain, notoriously cruel, and comprehensively incompetent. His response to the defeat of the Patriots was a regime of terror, arrests, executions, and the confiscation of properties belonging to independence sympathizers. The Reconquista, the Spanish reconquest, was exactly as brutal as the Patriots had feared it would be. Most of the independence leaders huddled in exile in Mendoza, Argentina, licking their wounds and arguing about what had gone wrong. Manuel Rodriguez crossed the Andes with them, but he did not stay in Mendoza for long. The Ghost Who Crossed the Mountains, 1814 to 1817. In Mendoza, the exiled Chilean patriots found a powerful ally waiting for them, General José de San Martín, the Argentine governor of the Cuyo province and one of the greatest military minds in South American history. San Martín had a grand vision, a coordinated campaign of liberation that would sweep across the Andes, free Chile, and then push north to liberate Peru, the heart of Spanish power in South America. To execute this plan, he needed soldiers, money, horses, and, perhaps most critically, intelligence about the Spanish forces inside Chile. He found his intelligence officer in Manuel Rodriguez. San Martín was a superb judge of talent. He recognized immediately that Rodriguez possessed a rare combination of qualities: physical courage bordering on recklessness, a natural gift for disguise and deception, a social fluency that allowed him to move comfortably among aristocrats and peasants alike, and a burning personal hatred for the Spanish colonial system. He was the ideal spy, San Martín would later say, because he was shrewd, he was brave, and he could become anyone. He crossed the Andes in disguise, carrying intelligence that armies could not have gathered, and then crossed back again, and again, and again, until the Spanish began to believe he was a ghost. And so Manuel Rodriguez became a ghost. He recrossed the Andes, one of the most formidable mountain ranges on Earth, with passes rising above 4,000 meters, alone or with small bands of trusted companions, carrying messages, gathering information, and organizing resistance networks inside Spanish-controlled Chile. He traveled in disguise, sometimes as a Franciscan monk, robes and all, with forged letters of introduction from a bishop, sometimes as a simple farmer with a cartload of produce, hiding coded documents in the hollow handles of his tools.
sometimes as a domestic servant, sometimes, according to persistent legend, as a woman. The Spanish colonial authorities placed a bounty on his head and declared him the most wanted man in Chile. Governor Marco del Ponte's security apparatus hunted him relentlessly. They never caught him.
Rodriguez seemed to materialize and vanish at will, striking where least expected and disappearing before the Spanish could respond. He raided Spanish military posts, freed political prisoners, distributed pamphlets, and recruited new fighters to the cause, all while the Spanish soldiers chased his shadow. The attack on Melipilla and San Fernando. Among Rodriguez's most audacious actions were simultaneous raids on the Spanish garrisons at Melipilla and San Fernando in early 1817. These were not just military operations, they were strategic theater. San Martin was preparing to bring the Liberation Army across the Andes, and he needed the Spanish forces spread thin and confused. Rodriguez's attacks accomplished exactly that, forcing Governor Marco del Ponte to scatter his defenses across multiple threat points, while the real blow was being prepared in the mountains above. To the ordinary Chileans living under the Reconquista's repression, Rodriguez was something more than a spy or a military officer. He was a symbol, proof that the resistance had not died at Rancagua, that Chile still had fighters, that freedom was still possible. Stories about him multiplied and grew in the telling, that he had attended a dinner party at the governor's own mansion while disguised as a Franciscan friar, that he had escaped a roadblock by pretending to be a drunk peasant, that he could not be captured because God was personally protecting him. The legends were more important than their accuracy. They kept hope alive during the darkest years of the Reconquest. In February 1817, San Martin's moment finally came. The Liberation Army, some 5,000 soldiers, Chileans and Argentines together, along with 10,000 horses, mules, and cattle, crossed the Andes in one of the most extraordinary military operations in history. They came over 4 different passes simultaneously, confusing the Spanish as to where the main force would emerge. The Andes in February are brutal, even in summer. Thin air, sudden blizzards, temperatures that plunge to lethal cold at night. A quarter of the horses died. Hundreds of soldiers suffered severe frostbite. They came across anyway. February 12th, 1817. The Battle of Chacabuco. San Martin and O'Higgins's Liberation Army crushes the Royalist forces outside Santiago. The Spanish flee south. 2 days later, the Patriot Army enters Santiago in triumph. Chile is free. For the second time, and this time, they intend to make it stick. Victory and the Serpent in the Garden, 1817. The liberation of Santiago should have been a moment of pure triumph. For Rodriguez, who had risked his life a dozen times over to bring this day closer, who had crossed those mountains in the dark and fooled the Spanish colonial government with a friar's robe and a farmer's hat, it was, for a few days, exactly that. But politics in a new republic are never simple, and Chilean politics in 1817 were particularly treacherous. The liberation had been achieved by a coalition held together by necessity and personal charisma. Now that the Spanish had been driven from Santiago, the old rivalries resurfaced with a vengeance. The central conflict was between 2 men, O'Higgins and the Carrera family. Bernardo O'Higgins was a remarkable figure, the illegitimate son of an Irish-born Spanish colonial governor, educated in England, deeply influenced by the ideals of the Enlightenment, and absolutely committed to Chilean independence. After Chacabuco, he was named the new republic's supreme director, effectively its head of state and government. He was disciplined, energetic, and genuinely devoted to Chile's future. He was also deeply insecure, prone to listening to bad advice, and terrified of anyone whose popularity might challenge his own. The Carrera family, Jose Miguel and his brothers Juan Jose and Luis, were exactly the kind of threat O'Higgins feared. They commanded powerful loyalties among the Criollo elite and the urban poor alike. Jose Miguel Carrera, still in exile in Argentina, was maneuvering to return to Chile and reclaim political power. And Manuel Rodriguez, as Carrera's oldest and most prominent supporter inside Chile, was therefore a political problem of the first order. The trap was beginning to close. Rodriguez had fought for Chile's independence with more personal courage than almost any other man alive. But independence had been achieved under O'Higgins' leadership, backed by San Martin's army, and both men were determined that the Carrera faction would not share in the political fruits of victory. Rodriguez found himself celebrated by the people and suspected by the government he had helped create. Immediately after Chacabuco, O'Higgins ordered Rodriguez's arrest. The charge was vague: conspiracy, Carrerista sympathies, but the intent was clear: get the most dangerous popular figure in Chile off the streets before he could be used as a focal point for the opposition. Rodriguez escaped the arrest, went into hiding, and was eventually rescued from the situation by San Martin himself, who intervened with O'Higgins on his behalf and secured Rodriguez the rank of lieutenant colonel in the Republican Army. It was a temporary resolution that satisfied no one. The Spanish had been expelled from Santiago, but they had not been destroyed. They still held strong positions in southern Chile, and the Royalist High Command in Peru was already planning a counterattack. Independence was won, but not yet secured. And in March 1818, disaster struck.
We still have a fatherland, citizens. March 1818. The Second Battle of Cancha Rayada on the night of March 19, 1818, was a catastrophe. A royalist force under General Mariano Osorio launched a surprise night attack on the Patriot army camped near the town of Talca in central Chile. The attack came so suddenly that entire units barely had time to form up before they were overwhelmed. San Martin was nearly captured. O'Higgins was shot in the right arm and had to be carried from the field. The Patriot army scattered in the darkness, streaming northward in disarray. By the time riders reached Santiago with news of the battle, the report had become a rumor, and the rumor had become a catastrophe. O'Higgins was dead. San Martin was captured. The Spanish army was marching on Santiago. The revolution was over. It was not true, but no one in Santiago knew that yet. The city fell into panic. Government ministers began packing their papers. Wealthy families loaded their valuables onto carts. The streets of Santiago filled with shouting,
Weeping, and the particular sound of a city preparing to abandon itself. The political leaders were already organizing the retreat back to Mendoza. Chile, it seemed, was about to fall a second time. Into this chaos stepped Manuel Rodriguez. He appeared in the streets of Santiago in his military uniform and began doing what he had always done best: talking to people. He moved through the plazas and the markets and the barracks, gathering the panic-stricken citizens and soldiers around him, and he spoke to them with the direct, urgent clarity of a man who absolutely means every word he says. He organized the city's defenses. He rallied militias. He appointed officers. He transformed the chaos into something approaching order.
Aún tenemos patria, ciudadanos. We still have a fatherland, citizens. Manuel Rodriguez, Santiago, March 1818, his most famous words.
The people rallied around him. In the absence of any legitimate authority, with O'Higgins presumed dead and the government in flight, Rodriguez became the de facto leader of the Republic. Self-proclaimed supreme director for approximately 30 hours. He organized an extraordinary popular mobilization. Citizens arming themselves, priests blessing weapons from church altars, women tearing up their petticoats to make bandages and cartridge bags. Santiago was not going to flee. Santiago was going to fight. And then, 30 hours after Rodriguez had taken charge of the capital, a blood-stained man on a sweat-drenched horse came galloping into the city. It was O'Higgins himself, badly wounded, arm in a sling, but very much alive. The reports of his death had been wrong. The Spanish had not destroyed the Patriot Army. They had scattered it, but San Martin was already rallying it in the countryside. Rodriguez immediately and publicly surrendered authority back to O'Higgins. He made no claim to power, issued no challenge. Whatever his political ambitions, in this moment he behaved with the cleanest kind of loyalty. Loyalty to Chile rather than to himself. He stepped aside. O'Higgins looked at the city that Rodriguez had saved, at the mobilized citizens still carrying their improvised weapons, at the streets buzzing with the man's name, and he was afraid. Rodriguez had demonstrated in 30 hours what no political argument could, that he commanded a loyalty and a love from the Chilean people that O'Higgins himself had never managed to inspire. A man like that, alive and free in a republic where politics was still undecided, was a permanent threat. Something had to be done. The Hussars of Death March, April 1818. In the frantic days after Cancha Rayada, Rodriguez had done something else that sealed his fate. Together with supporters of the Carrera faction, he had organized and personally commanded a new cavalry regiment, which he named, with characteristic dramatic flair, the Hussars de la Muerte, the Hussars of Death. The Hussars of Death were everything their name suggested. Their uniform was entirely black. Black tunic, black breeches, black boots, black cap, with a single macabre emblem, a white skull and crossed bones on the collar, symbolizing their vow to die rather than surrender. Rodriguez had always understood the power of symbolism. He knew that armies fight not just with weapons, but with myths, and that a regiment that looked like death riding a horse inspired both terror in the enemy and fierce pride in its own men. The streets of Santiago, in those tense days between Cancha Rayada and the next battle, were full of the hussars in their black uniforms and their skull insignias, and the citizens loved them with the passionate, uncomplicated love that people give to symbols of defiance when they are frightened. Rodriguez in his black uniform, astride his horse, his dark eyes burning with the urgency of the moment. He was the image of the revolution at its most elemental. The Hussars of Death, a dangerous symbol. O'Higgins and San Martin both recognized the Hussars of Death as a political threat as much as a military asset. The regiment was associated with the Carrera faction, drew its recruits from Carrera loyalists, and was personally commanded by the most popular man in Chile. When it came time to organize the battle that would finally decide Chile's independence, both O'Higgins and San Martin made sure the Hussars were excluded. The regiment and its commander was deliberately kept off the battlefield where glory would be won. April 5th, 1818. The Battle of Maipú, fought on the plains south of Santiago, is the decisive engagement of Chilean independence. San Martin's reorganized liberation army, augmented by local Chilean forces, crushes the royalist army in a battle that lasts less than 4 hours. The Spanish forces in central Chile are destroyed. Chilean independence is effectively secured. The Hussars of Death are not permitted to participate. After Maipú, the Hussars of Death were dissolved by order of O'Higgins. The regiment was broken up. Its men were dispersed to other units. Its black uniforms were packed away. O'Higgins had tolerated the regiment as a political necessity during the crisis. Now that the crisis was resolved, it was an instrument of opposition that he could not afford to leave standing. Rodriguez himself was watched, isolated, and denied any meaningful military command. He was too prominent to simply ignore and too beloved to openly persecute. But O'Higgins's government worked steadily to limit his influence, block his access to the machinery of the new republic, and wait for an opportunity to neutralize him permanently. The opportunity came from an unexpected direction. The conspiracy that may not have existed, April-May 1818. In April 1818, just weeks after Maipú, O'Higgins's government announced that it had uncovered a conspiracy. The details were murky and have never been fully established by historians. The claim was that Carrerista elements, supporters of the exiled José Miguel Carrera, were plotting to destabilize the new republic, overthrow O'Higgins, and install Carrera as the leader of independent Chile. Whether this conspiracy was real, exaggerated, or entirely fabricated has been debated ever since. What is not in doubt is how O'Higgins used the accusation. Rodriguez was arrested and charged with participation in the alleged plot. He was given no trial. The charges were never formally proven in any court of law. He was simply imprisoned by executive order, the new republic deploying exactly the kind of arbitrary political detention that he had spent years fighting against under the Spanish. Inside Santiago, there was outrage, whispered, frightened outrage, the kind that people express to each other quietly when they do not yet dare to speak loudly. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. Rodriguez was held in Santiago for a few weeks while his enemies in the government decided what to do with him. Simply holding him was not a solution. He was too famous, too beloved, and his imprisonment was becoming a focus of popular resentment. Executing him openly and formally was politically too dangerous. A public execution would make him a martyr and trigger a reaction that O'Higgins could not control. The decision was made to transfer him to the military prison at Quillota, far from Santiago, where he could be quietly held and slowly forgotten. May 25th, 1818. The evening before his transfer, Rodriguez is said to have been visited in his cell by a friend who warned him that he would not survive the journey. According to the account, Rodriguez replied calmly, "If they kill me on the road, it will only prove that I was right about them all along." He spent that last night writing letters.
On the morning of May 26, 1818, the escort arrived and the transfer began. The soldiers were from the Cazadores de los Andes battalion, commanded by an officer named Antonio Navarro. They took the prisoner north from Santiago on the road toward Quillota. They never arrived.
The road to Til, May 26, 1818. The hills around Til are dry and brown and quiet. The village itself is small, a handful of houses, a chapel, a scattering of farms. In May of 1818, it was the kind of place where no one would notice a small military escort traveling north on the main road, and where witnesses could be discouraged with a glance. The exact circumstances of what happened near Til on May 26, 1818, have never been definitively established. The official account, put out by the O'Higgins government the following day, was that Manuel Rodriguez had been shot while attempting to escape his escort. It was the oldest story in the book of political murder. The convenient, deniable, unchallenged killing of a prisoner who tried to run. Historians and Chileans have never accepted this account. Several pieces of evidence argue strongly against it. Rodriguez was traveling in chains or under close guard. He was on horseback in open terrain surrounded by armed soldiers. He had spent the previous night writing letters, not planning an escape. And perhaps most damningly, the official response to his death, the silence, the refusal to investigate, the immediate suppression of public mourning, bore all the marks of a government that knew exactly what had happened and was frantically trying to manage the consequences.
What is known for certain is this. Somewhere on the road near Til, soldiers of the Cazadores de los Andes battalion shot Manuel Rodriguez Erdoza. He was 33 years old, The same age Chileans would later note with the instinct for sacred numbers that runs deep in Catholic culture, as Jesus Christ at his crucifixion. The body was mutilated, deliberately disfigured, as if to prevent identification or to express a contempt that went beyond mere killing. It was thrown into a ditch beside the road and left there. The order for the execution is widely attributed, by contemporary accounts and by subsequent historical scholarship, to O'Higgins himself or to members of his inner circle acting with his knowledge. He never admitted it. He never denied it either. He left the silence to speak for him, and in that silence, his guilt, or at minimum his complicity, was read by virtually everyone who lived through those events.
The Secret Burial, May 26, 1818, and after? The peasants of Tiltil found the body. Some of them recognized it. Word spread through the village in whispers, the way all terrible news spreads in places where speaking too loudly can get you killed. They knew who the man was. They knew what had been done to him, and they knew that if the government found out they had given him a proper burial, there would be consequences. They buried him anyway. With the help of the local priest, they carried Rodriguez's body to the village's small chapel of La Merced and buried him beneath the altar, the most sacred and most hidden place they could offer. They covered all traces of the grave. They told no one outside the village. In doing so, these anonymous farmers and a country priest did something that all of O'Higgins' soldiers and all of his government's power could not. They preserved Manuel Rodriguez from disappearing. The government announced the death with a terseness that itself spoke volumes. There was no official mourning. There was no funeral, no ceremony, no formal recognition of his service to Chile. The man who had crossed the Andes in a friar's robe, who had raided Spanish garrisons and freed prisoners, who had stood in the streets of Santiago and told a panicking city that it still had a fatherland. That man was simply gone, and the government that he had helped create wished to say as little about it as possible. The silence had the opposite of its intended effect. Silences about the deaths of beloved people do not create forgetting. They create obsession. Across Chile, people talked about Manuel Rodriguez in urgent, hushed, furious tones. They talked about who had done it and why. They talked about what it meant that the new republic had murdered its own hero. They talked about what kind of freedom this was, if it could do to its own champions what the Spanish had never quite managed to do. They killed him because they feared him, and in killing him, they made him impossible to forget. O'Higgins himself was gone from power within 4 years. His authoritarian style, his high-handed governance, and the popular memory of what had been done to Rodriguez combined to erode his base of support. In January 1823, faced with widespread revolt, he resigned as supreme director and went into exile in Peru, where he died in 1842. He is remembered today as one of Chile's founding fathers. His face is on the money, his name is on highways and public squares, but the shadow of May 26, 1818 has never quite left him. The apparition. How a murder made a legend. In the decades and centuries after his death, Manuel Rodriguez became something Chile did not quite intend: a permanent conscience. His story was the story the new republic told about itself when it wanted to examine its own failures. A reminder that revolutions can devour the very people who make them possible. That freedom is not automatically guaranteed by the defeat of the old oppressor. And that political power has always been perfectly willing to destroy whoever stands in its way, including its own heroes. The great folk singer Victor Jara, himself assassinated by Chile's military dictatorship in September 1973, in what stands as a terrible historical rhyme, wrote a song called El Aparecido, the appeared one, or the apparition, dedicated to Manuel Rodriguez.
The title referred to both Rodriguez's legendary ability to appear and disappear at will during his guerrilla years, and to the quality of the man's memory, always reappearing, never entirely gone, summoned again and again by each new generation that found itself in need of his example.
The legacy of Manuel Rodriguez. In the 20th century, a left-wing guerrilla group fighting against Pinochet's military dictatorship named itself the Frente Patriotic Manuel Rodriguez, deliberately invoking his memory as a symbol of resistance against tyranny from within the state. His face appears on Chilean currency, his name on streets, schools, and plazas throughout the country. The town of Tiltil, where he was killed, erected a monument at the site of his assassination. His body was eventually moved to the General Cemetery of Santiago, though some researchers believe the remains moved there may have been misidentified, and that the real Rodriguez may still lie beneath the chapel at Tiltil, exactly where the peasants hid him 2 centuries ago. He was 33 years old when they killed him. He had crossed the Andes in disguise, fought a colonial empire, saved a capital city, and died at the hands of the republic he bled for. Chile has never finished arguing about him. And perhaps that is exactly as it should be.
Every revolution produces its heroes, and every revolution then produces the question of what to do with them once they are no longer needed. Some heroes retire gracefully. Some are bought off. Some find new wars to fight in distant places. And some, the ones who cannot be co-opted and will not be silenced, whose very existence is a reminder of principles the new power has already begun to abandon. Some of those are sent north on a road to a quiet town in the hills and never arrive. On May 26, 1818, exactly 208 years ago today, that is what happened to Manuel Rodriguez Erdoza, a lawyer who became a spy who became a guerrilla who became a folk hero who became, in the end, inconvenient. He was shot on the road to Tiltil by soldiers of the republic he had helped create. Peasants buried him beneath an altar, and Chile never forgot him. Aún tenemos patria, ciudadanos. We still have a fatherland, citizens. On this day, May 26, 1818, the assassination of Manuel Rodriguez Erdoza, Chile's first political murder,